The final decades of the Yuan dynasty unfolded as a long, grinding collapse rather than a sudden fall. By the middle of the 14th century, the Mongol rulers who had once conquered all of China were presiding over a fractured empire strained by famine, corruption, ethnic division, and a political system that had lost its ability to respond to crisis. The Yuan state, founded by Kublai Khan in the year 1271, had always ruled as a foreign dynasty, relying on a rigid hierarchy that placed Mongols at the top, followed by Central Asians, then Northern Chinese, and finally Southern Chinese at the bottom. Over time, this structure hardened resentment across society, especially as economic conditions deteriorated, and the court in Dadu, known later as Beijing, grew increasingly detached from the realities of rural life. Natural disasters played a decisive role in accelerating the dynasty's decline. Throughout the early and mid-14th century, the Yellow River repeatedly flooded, destroying farmland and displacing entire communities. Extended droughts followed by sudden deluges ruined harvests, while outbreaks of disease swept through already weakened populations. These calamities were not new to Chinese history, but under the Yuan, they became symbols of imperial failure. In the Confucian worldview shared by much of the population, such disasters were interpreted as signs that heaven had withdrawn its mandate from the ruling house. As relief efforts faltered and local officials exploited chaos for personal gain, faith in the Yuan regime eroded further. At the center of the problem was a court consumed by factionalism and financial exhaustion. The Yuan government relied heavily on paper currency, which had once been an innovation but now suffered from overissuance and inflation. Taxes increased while real wages fell, especially for peasants and urban laborers. Mongol elites remained largely exempt from many burdens, deepening ethnic and social divides. Corruption spread through every level of administration, with offices openly sold and justice routinely distorted by bribery. The Emperor Togon Temur, who ruled from the year 1333 until 1368, proved unable or unwilling to impose meaningful reform. His reign became marked by indecision, indulgence, and withdrawal from governance, leaving effective power in the hands of rival ministers and generals. Against this backdrop, popular unrest turned into open rebellion. The most significant of these movements emerged under the banner of the Red Turban Army, a loose coalition of groups inspired by millenarian Buddhist beliefs and fueled by desperation rather than coherent ideology. They promised the overthrow of Mongol rule and the restoration of Chinese sovereignty, appealing directly to peasants, salt workers, and displaced laborers. What began as scattered uprisings gradually coalesced into organized resistance across large swaths of the empire. Among the countless figures drawn into this turmoil was a man of humble origins named Zhu Yuanzhang. Born into extreme poverty in the year 1328, Zhu lost his parents and siblings to famine and disease while still a teenager. With no land, no family, and no prospects, he entered a Buddhist monastery simply to survive, relying on alms and shelter. Even that refuge proved temporary, as the monastery itself collapsed under economic strain. Forced onto the roads as a wandering beggar, Zhu experienced firsthand the full brutality of Yuan misrule, an experience that would later shape both his ambition and his methods. Zhu eventually joined the Red Turban forces, not as a visionary leader at first, but as a capable and disciplined subordinate. Unlike many rebel commanders who relied on charisma or brute force, Zhu distinguished himself through organization, restraint, and an unusual ability to win popular support. He enforced strict discipline among his troops, prohibited looting, and cultivated alliances with local elites and scholars who had grown alienated from the Yuan regime. This combination allowed him to transform a rebel band into a proto-state, complete with administration, taxation, and logistical planning. As the Red Turban movement fragmented into competing factions, Zhu Yuanzhang steadily eliminated his rivals, sometimes through open warfare, sometimes through calculated betrayal. By the early 1360s, he controlled much of the lower Yangtze River region, one of the richest areas in China. In the year 1366, he proclaimed the establishment of a new regime, signaling that his ambitions extended far beyond rebellion. 2 years later, in the year 1368, his forces marched north toward Dadu, the Yuan capital. The fall of Dadu marked the effective end of Yuan rule in China proper. Facing advancing armies and internal disarray, the Yuan court fled north toward the Mongolian steppe, abandoning the heart of the empire. Togon Temur did not formally abdicate, but his departure shattered any remaining claim to authority south of the Great Wall. For many Chinese contemporaries, this moment represented not merely a change of dynasty, but the restoration of native rule after nearly a century of foreign domination. Later in the same year, Zhu Yuanzhang declared himself emperor, adopting the reign title Hongwu and founding the Ming dynasty. The name Ming, meaning bright, was chosen deliberately, signaling a moral and cosmic renewal after what was portrayed as the darkness of Mongol rule. Yet the end of the Yuan did not bring immediate peace or prosperity. Vast regions lay devastated by years of war. Irrigation systems were ruined, and population levels had plummeted. The new emperor faced the immense task of rebuilding a shattered society, while ensuring that no rival could ever threaten his authority again. The manner in which Zhu Yuanzhang rose to power left a deep imprint on his worldview. Having witnessed the chaos of a collapsing dynasty and survived a ruthless struggle among rebel leaders, he emerged convinced that disorder was humanity's natural state and that only uncompromising control could prevent collapse. The lessons he drew from the Yuan downfall would shape every aspect of his rule, from his obsession with centralized power to his relentless suspicion of officials, generals, and even members of his own family. Thus, the fall of the Yuan dynasty was not simply the conclusion of Mongol rule in China, but the crucible from which the Ming state was forged. It demonstrated how environmental disaster, economic mismanagement, ethnic division, and political paralysis could destroy even a once mighty empire. At the same time, it revealed how a single individual, rising from the margins of society, could exploit these fractures to seize the mandate of heaven. The story of the Ming dynasty begins here, in the ruins of the Yuan, shaped by collapse, suffering, and the hard lessons learned from the failure of an empire. The ascension of Zhu Yuanzhang as the Hongwu emperor did not mark a gentle transition from chaos to stability, but the beginning of a rule defined by vigilance, fear, and an uncompromising belief that only absolute control could prevent China from falling back into disorder. Having risen from famine, exile, and rebellion, Hongwu viewed the world through the lens of survival. To him, the collapse of the Yuan dynasty had not been an accident of fate, but the inevitable result of weak rulers, corrupt officials, and a system that allowed power to diffuse beyond the throne. From the very beginning of the Ming dynasty, he resolved that such a failure would never be repeated under his watch. Hongwu's first priority was the reconstruction of the state. Years of warfare had devastated farmland, destroyed irrigation networks, and displaced millions. The emperor ordered large-scale land registration to restore agricultural production and stabilize taxation. Peasants who had fled during the wars were encouraged to return, and in some cases, compelled to do so. Abandoned fields were redistributed, and families were recorded into detailed household registers. These measures were not merely economic, they were instruments of control. By knowing who lived where, how much land they held, and how many mouths they fed, the state could extract labor, grain, and taxes with precision. Central to this system was the establishment of the leisure structure, a rigid form of collective responsibility that grouped households together for taxation, corvée, labor, and mutual surveillance. Each group was made responsible for the conduct and obligations of its members, ensuring that resistance or evasion by one household could bring punishment upon many. This structure penetrated deeply into village life, binding rural society directly to the imperial bureaucracy and reducing the space for independent local power. At the administrative level, Hongwu launched sweeping reforms to dismantle what he saw as the root causes of Yuan corruption. He abolished the position of chancellor entirely, eliminating the office that had traditionally served as a buffer between the emperor and the bureaucracy. In its place, he concentrated authority directly in his own hands, personally overseeing the 6 ministries that managed personnel, revenue, rights, war, justice, and public works. This was a radical departure from previous dynastic practice and signaled Hongwu's belief that delegation was inherently dangerous. The legal foundation of the new dynasty was laid through the Ming Code, a comprehensive body of law that emphasized moral order, hierarchy, and harsh punishment. Crimes against authority, disobedience, and corruption were met with severe penalties, including exile, corporal punishment, and execution. The law made little distinction between intent and outcome, reflecting Hongwu's conviction that fear was a necessary tool of governance. To him, mercy invited decay. Nowhere was this philosophy more evident than in his treatment of officials. Although Hongwu relied heavily on educated scholar bureaucrats to administer the empire, he deeply distrusted them. He believed that learning bred arrogance, and that officials were naturally inclined toward factionalism and self-interest. To counter this, he revived and expanded the censorate, empowering officials whose sole duty was to monitor, investigate, and report misconduct throughout the bureaucracy. These censors operated with extraordinary authority, often bypassing normal administrative channels to report directly to the emperor. Yet even the censorate was not enough to satisfy Hongwu's obsession with oversight. He established the embroidered uniform guard, known as the Jinyue, an elite secret police force that answered only to the throne. Officially tasked with protecting the emperor, the Jinyue quickly evolved into an instrument of terror. They conducted arrests, interrogations, and executions without the constraints of ordinary legal procedure. Their presence sent a clear message. No official, regardless of rank or service, was beyond suspicion. This climate of fear culminated in a series of massive purges that reshaped the Ming political elite. The most infamous of these was the Hu Weiyong case. Hu, once a trusted senior official, was accused of plotting rebellion. In the year 1380, Hongwu ordered his execution, followed by a sweeping investigation that extended far beyond Hu himself. Tens of thousands were implicated, including relatives, associates, and even distant acquaintances. Entire families were wiped out, and the bureaucracy was thrown into paralysis, as officials feared that any misstep could be interpreted as treason. A similar pattern emerged in the Lan Yu case, which targeted senior military commanders. Lan Yu, a celebrated general who had played a crucial role in defeating the Yuan, was accused of arrogance and conspiracy. His execution in the year 1393 triggered another wave of killings that decimated the upper ranks of the military. Through these purges, Hongwu eliminated not only real or imagined threats, but also the possibility of alternative centers of loyalty within the state. While these actions consolidated imperial authority, they came at a profound human cost. The bureaucracy became increasingly cautious and inward-looking, prioritizing survival over initiative. Officials avoided bold policies, innovation, or dissent, fearing that visibility itself could be fatal. This atmosphere of repression would shape the character of Ming governance long after Hongwu's death. In the military sphere, Hongwu implemented reforms designed to prevent the rise of independent warlords. He established the Waisuo system, organizing soldiers into hereditary military households that were assigned land to farm in peacetime. This system aimed to create a self-sustaining army that did not burden the treasury, while ensuring that military power remained fragmented and tied directly to the state. Commanders were frequently rotated, and no general was allowed to maintain long-term control over a single region. Foreign policy under Hongwu reflected the same inward-focused mentality. Having expelled the Mongols from China proper, he sought to secure the northern frontier while avoiding costly expansion. Defensive fortifications were strengthened, and diplomatic relations were framed within a tributary system that emphasized Ming supremacy without extensive overseas engagement. Trade was tightly regulated, and private maritime activity was restricted, reflecting fears that wealth and contact with foreigners could undermine social order. At the heart of all these policies was Hongwu's personal vision of rulership. He saw himself not merely as an administrator, but as a moral patriarch responsible for correcting the flaws of society. He issued numerous proclamations instructing officials and commoners alike on proper behavior, family relations, and loyalty to the throne. In his eyes, the emperor stood at the center of the universe, the sole guarantor of harmony between heaven and earth. Yet this vision contained a contradiction that would haunt the Ming dynasty. By concentrating power so completely in the hands of the emperor and ruling through fear, Hongwu ensured stability in the short term, but weakened the institutional resilience of the state. Governance depended increasingly on the personality and vigilance of the ruler himself. When that vigilance faltered, the system he created would prove dangerously brittle. By the end of his reign, Hongwu had succeeded in restoring order to a land ravaged by war, and in building one of the most centralized states in Chinese history. But he had also planted the seeds of future crises. His relentless purges, suspicion of officials, and dismantling of traditional checks within the bureaucracy left a legacy of fear and rigidity. The Ming dynasty stood strong, but it stood rigid, balanced precariously on the authority of the throne. As the Hongwu emperor aged, the question of succession loomed large. The system he had constructed allowed no room for error at the top. Whoever followed him would inherit not only a powerful empire, but also the impossible burden of ruling within a framework designed by a man who trusted no one but himself. The struggle to maintain that legacy would soon plunge the dynasty into its first great internal conflict. The death of the Hongwu emperor did not bring calm succession, but exposed the first major fracture within the Ming system he had so carefully and ruthlessly constructed. Hongwu died in the year 1398, leaving the throne not to one of his many surviving sons, but to his grandson Zhu Yunwen, who ascended as the Jianwen emperor. This decision reflected Hongwu's desire to preserve direct imperial authority while preventing the rise of powerful regional princes. Yet it also ignored a political reality he himself had created. His sons commanded armies, governed strategic territories, and possessed deep networks of loyalty that could not simply be erased by decree. From the moment Jianwen took the throne, tension was unavoidable. He was young, inexperienced, and surrounded by advisors who believed that the greatest threat to the dynasty came not from external enemies, but from the imperial princes themselves. Acting on this advice, Jianwen initiated a campaign to reduce their power. Princes were stripped of troops, demoted, placed under surveillance, or accused of fabricated crimes. Several were imprisoned or driven to suicide. Each move, intended to secure the throne, instead sent a clear signal that survival required resistance. The most dangerous of these princes was Zhu Di, the Prince of Yan, stationed in the north at Beiping, the future Beijing. Zhu Di commanded veteran troops hardened by frontier warfare against Mongol remnants. He was a seasoned military leader, deeply aware of both his strength and the danger he faced if Jianwen's policies continued. In the year 1399, Zhu Di launched an uprising that would come to be known as the Jingnan Campaign, framing his rebellion not as treason, but as a moral crusade to rescue the dynasty from corrupt advisors and restore proper governance. What followed was a brutal civil war that shattered the illusion of Ming unity. Over the course of several years, armies loyal to the Jianwen emperor clashed repeatedly with Zhu Di's forces. Cities changed hands, supply lines were cut, and entire regions were devastated. Zhu Di proved both ruthless and patient, exploiting weaknesses in the imperial command structure and drawing on the loyalty of northern garrisons. Meanwhile, the court in Nanjing struggled to coordinate an effective response, hampered by internal divisions and an emperor whose authority was steadily eroding. In the year 1402, Zhu Di's forces broke through the defenses of Nanjing. The capital fell in chaos and fire. The Jianwen emperor disappeared from history at that moment, his fate uncertain. Official records claimed he perished in the burning palace, yet rumors persisted for decades that he escaped disguised as a monk, wandering the empire in exile. Whatever the truth, his reign ended abruptly, erased by violence and silence. Zhu Di ascended the throne as the Yongle emperor, marking a dramatic reversal of the policies that had defined the early Ming. Where Hongwu had ruled from suspicion and inward focus, Yongle embraced expansion, visibility, and spectacle as tools of legitimacy. He immediately set about rewriting history, declaring the Jingnan campaign a righteous correction rather than a rebellion. Records were altered, officials compelled to endorse the official narrative, and dissent ruthlessly suppressed. In this way, Yongle ensured that his rule would be remembered not as usurpation, but as restoration. One of Yongle's most consequential decisions was the relocation of the imperial capital. Although Nanjing remained symbolically important, Yongle recognized that true power lay in the north, where threats from the steppe persisted. He transformed Beiping into Beijing, meaning northern capital, and made it the political center of the empire. This shift reoriented the Ming state geographically and strategically, placing the emperor closer to the frontier armies and reinforcing the military character of his reign. At the heart of this new capital rose one of the most ambitious architectural projects in human history, the Forbidden City. Constructed over more than a decade and completed in the early 15th century, the palace complex embodied Yongle's vision of imperial authority. Vast courtyards, towering halls, and meticulously ordered spaces conveyed a cosmic hierarchy with the emperor at its center. Built using resources drawn from across the empire, including timber transported over immense distances and labor conscripted by the hundreds of thousands, the Forbidden City was not merely a residence, but a statement of absolute power made visible in stone and wood. Yongle's ambition extended far beyond architecture. Determined to assert Ming supremacy both domestically and internationally, he launched a series of massive military campaigns. In the north, he personally led expeditions against Mongol groups, seeking to prevent any resurgence of steppe power that could threaten the dynasty. These campaigns were costly and often inconclusive, but they reinforced Yongle's image as a warrior emperor and kept the military firmly under imperial control. Even more striking were the maritime expeditions he sponsored under the command of the eunuch admiral Zheng He. Beginning in the year 1405, enormous fleets set sail from China's southern ports, traveling through Southeast Asia, across the Indian Ocean, and as far as the eastern coast of Africa. These voyages dwarfed anything previously attempted by any civilization, involving hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of personnel. The fleets carried silks, porcelain, and imperial gifts, returning with exotic goods, animals, and envoys from distant lands. The purpose of these expeditions was not colonization or conquest, but demonstration. Zheng He's voyages projected the image of the Ming emperor as ruler of a world order in which foreign states acknowledged Chinese supremacy through tribute. Kings and rulers were brought to Beijing to perform rituals of submission, reinforcing Yongle's claim to universal authority. At the same time, These voyages allowed the emperor to gather intelligence, secure trade routes, and reinforce his legitimacy at home by showcasing the grandeur of his rule. Internally, Yongle relied heavily on eunuchs to balance the power of the civil bureaucracy. Distrustful of scholar officials who had supported Jianwen, he expanded the influence of palace eunuchs, granting them authority over intelligence, military logistics, and foreign affairs. This shift created a parallel power structure within the state, one that answered directly to the emperor. While effective in the short term, it introduced a dynamic that would later destabilize Ming politics, as eunuchs accumulated influence beyond any formal institutional restraint. Yongle also sought to control knowledge and memory. He commissioned the Yongle Encyclopedia, an unprecedented compilation of Chinese learning that aimed to gather all known texts into a single authoritative work. Although most of it would eventually be lost, the project symbolized the emperor's desire to present himself as the ultimate patron of culture, learning, and orthodoxy. At the same time, censorship tightened, and scholars who challenged the official narrative of his rise faced exile or execution. Despite the scale of his achievements, Yongle's reign carried immense costs. Military campaigns drained the treasury, construction projects consumed labor and resources, and the capital relocation imposed lasting logistical burdens. The empire appeared powerful, but much of that power depended on constant mobilization and the personal authority of the emperor himself. Institutions bent to his will rather than developing independent strength. When Yongle died in the year 1424, he left behind a transformed Ming dynasty. Its capital stood in the north, its prestige echoed across oceans, and its emperor had claimed a place among the most formidable rulers in Chinese history. Yet beneath this grandeur lay unresolved tensions. The empowerment of eunuchs, the marginalization of the civil bureaucracy, and the reliance on spectacle and force over institutional balance would shape the trajectory of the dynasty for generations to come. The Jingnan campaign had proven that the Ming state, for all its centralized power, remained vulnerable to internal conflict. Yongle had won that conflict through strength and vision, but he had also shown that legitimacy could be forged through violence as much as through tradition. The empire he left behind was vast, confident, and outward-looking, yet it stood on foundations increasingly shaped by imperial will rather than durable consensus. The consequences of that transformation would only become fully visible in the centuries ahead. The decades following the Yongle emperor's death marked a subtle but decisive shift in the character of the Ming dynasty. The outward confidence and expansive ambition of Yongle's reign gradually gave way to a more inward, bureaucratic, and increasingly fragile system of governance. Although the empire remained vast and wealthy, the balance between emperor, officials, and palace institutions began to tilt in ways that would define Ming politics for generations. This period, often described as the Middle Ming, was not a sudden decline but a slow accumulation of structural weaknesses hidden beneath a surface of order. Yongle's immediate successors inherited an empire stretched thin by military campaigns, monumental construction, and the costs of maintaining imperial prestige. The Hongxi emperor, who reigned briefly beginning in the year 1424, attempted to reverse some of his father's policies. He reduced military expeditions, curtailed palace expenditures, and sought to restore the authority of the civil bureaucracy. Yet his reign lasted less than a year, ending before meaningful reform could take root. His son, the Xuande emperor, continued some of these efforts and presided over a period of relative stability. But the deeper institutional shifts introduced under Yongle were already entrenched. Central to these shifts was the growing power of palace eunuchs. Originally intended as personal servants and trusted agents of the emperor, eunuchs had expanded their influence dramatically during Yongle's reign. In the absence of a strong, consistently engaged emperor, they became indispensable intermediaries between the throne and the bureaucracy. Over time, this access translated into power. Eunuchs controlled the flow of information, managed imperial workshops, oversaw tax revenues, and even exercised authority over military logistics. The most notorious manifestations of this power were the secret police organizations that emerged within the palace. The Eastern Depot, known as the Dongchang, and later the Western Depot, or Shichang, operated as intelligence and enforcement arms under eunuch leadership. These institutions monitored officials, investigated dissent, and conducted interrogations that often bypassed the regular legal system. Fear once again became a central instrument of governance. But unlike during the Hongwu era, it was no longer wielded exclusively by the emperor. Instead, it flowed through palace factions whose interests did not always align with the long-term stability of the state. At the same time, the civil bureaucracy faced its own contradictions. The examination system continued to produce highly educated scholar officials steeped in Confucian ideals of moral governance, restraint, and hierarchy. These officials viewed themselves as guardians of ethical rule and often clashed with eunuchs, whom they regarded as illegitimate wielders of power. Yet the scholars were also constrained by the very system they defended. Advancement depended on conformity, rhetorical orthodoxy, and avoidance of overt conflict with the throne. As a result, many officials chose cautious silence over principled resistance, allowing palace institutions to expand unchecked. The emperor himself increasingly withdrew from daily administration. While some Ming rulers remained diligent, others delegated extensively or retreated into ritual, leisure, or personal pursuits. This disengagement created a vacuum that eunuchs were eager to fill. Memorials from officials were filtered or delayed. Decisions were shaped by private influence rather than open deliberation, and policy coherence began to erode. The state continued to function, but it did so through improvisation rather than deliberate design. Economically, the Middle Ming period was marked by both growth and strain. Agricultural recovery following the early dynastic wars had restored food production, and population levels steadily increased. Commercial activity expanded, especially in urban centers and along major river systems. Markets thrived, handicrafts flourished, and silver gradually became the dominant medium of exchange, linking the Chinese economy more closely to global trade networks. This monetization brought prosperity to merchants and landowners, but it also introduced new vulnerabilities. Taxation increasingly relied on silver payments rather than grain or labor. While efficient in theory, this shift placed enormous pressure on peasants, who were often forced to sell crops at unfavorable prices to obtain silver for tax obligations. Regional disparities widened, and local officials exploited the complexity of the system to extract additional fees. What appeared as economic sophistication at the top translated into insecurity and resentment at the bottom. Militarily, the Ming state entered a period of relative stagnation. The Waisuo system established under Hongwu began to deteriorate as hereditary military households abandoned farming duties, sold land illegally, or sought exemptions through bribery. Troops became underpaid and poorly trained, while commanders lacked both resources and authority. On the northern frontier, Mongol groups remained a persistent threat, conducting raids that exposed weaknesses in border defenses. Rather than addressing these structural problems, the court often responded with short-term measures, such as emergency levies or symbolic campaigns, that failed to restore long-term effectiveness. Foreign relations during this era reflected a retreat from Yongl's expansive vision. The great maritime expeditions ceased, and overseas engagement was increasingly viewed as unnecessary or even dangerous. Maritime restrictions were reimposed, limiting private trade and naval development. While intended to preserve social order, these policies pushed commerce into informal and illicit channels, strengthening smuggling networks and weakening state oversight. Culturally, the Middle Ming was a period of remarkable intellectual and artistic vitality. Literature, philosophy, and the arts flourished, often in subtle tension with official ideology. thinkers explored questions of individual conscience, moral autonomy, and the limits of authority. These currents did not directly challenge imperial rule, but they reflected a society grappling with contradictions between official orthodoxy and lived reality. The state tolerated much of this activity as long as it remained apolitical. Yet the gap between cultural vitality and political rigidity continued to widen. Within the court, factionalism became increasingly pronounced. Officials aligned themselves with particular patrons, ideological positions, or palace networks in order to survive and advance. Policy debates hardened into personal rivalries, and consensus became elusive. Rather than functioning as a unified governing body, the bureaucracy fractured into competing camps, each seeking advantage in a system where institutional safeguards had weakened. The emperor's role as arbiter became more symbolic than decisive. Rituals were meticulously observed, edicts issued with formal authority, yet the substance of governance often emerged from behind the scenes. This separation between appearance and reality created a dangerous illusion of stability. The Ming state appeared orderly, hierarchical, and confident, but beneath that surface, accountability was eroding, and trust between institutions was collapsing. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, these trends had become deeply embedded. The dynasty was not yet in crisis, but the mechanisms that might have prevented crisis were steadily losing effectiveness. Power had drifted away from transparent institutions toward informal networks, fear-based enforcement, and personal influence. The lessons of the Yuan collapse, so vividly remembered by Hongwu, were fading from collective memory, replaced by complacency and routine. This period did not witness dramatic collapse or conquest, but its significance lies precisely in its gradual nature. The Middle Ming era set the conditions for future disaster by allowing structural weaknesses to normalize. The expansion of eunuch power, the disengagement of emperors, the fragmentation of the bureaucracy, and the economic pressures on the population all accumulated quietly, year after year. By the time more visible crises emerged, the foundations of the state would already be compromised. The Ming dynasty had survived rebellion, civil war, and foreign threat, but it now faced a more insidious danger, a system that continued to function while slowly hollowing itself out. The consequences of this long, uneven transformation would not become fully apparent until the empire was confronted by forces it could no longer absorb or deflect. The long erosion of Ming stability reached a breaking point in the early 17th century when environmental catastrophe, fiscal collapse, and political paralysis converged into a single, irreversible crisis. What had once been a resilient imperial system now struggled to meet even its most basic obligations. The warning signs had been visible for decades, but when disaster finally arrived, it did so with a speed and scale that the Ming state could no longer contain. Climatic change played a decisive role in this collapse. The period now known as the Little Ice Age brought colder temperatures, shorter growing seasons, and unpredictable weather across much of northern China. Repeated droughts and floods devastated agriculture, particularly in the Yellow River Basin. Harvest failures became increasingly common, and famine spread through provinces already burdened by heavy taxation and corruption. For millions of peasants, survival itself became uncertain, and the promises of imperial protection rang hollow. These natural disasters struck an economy already under immense strain. By this time, Ming fiscal policy depended almost entirely on silver taxation. While silver had once facilitated trade and simplified accounting, it now became a trap. Global disruptions in silver supply, driven by changes in overseas trade and conflict beyond China's borders, caused severe shortages. As silver grew scarce, its value rose sharply. Peasants were forced to sell more grain and labor to obtain the same amount of silver needed to meet tax obligations. Failure to pay brought punishment regardless of circumstance, deepening resentment and despair. The central government proved incapable of effective response. Revenue declined just as expenditures soared. Military costs rose due to persistent threats along the northern frontier, while disaster relief required resources the treasury no longer possessed. Officials submitted urgent memorials describing starving populations and abandoned villages, yet funds rarely arrived. Corruption siphoned off what little assistance was allocated, and local magistrates often prioritized personal survival over public duty. As the countryside descended into desperation, rebellion became not an ideological choice, but a necessity. Armed bands of starving peasants, former soldiers, and displaced workers began to roam the interior, seizing food and attacking local authorities. Among these groups emerged figures who would soon alter the course of Chinese history. The most prominent was Li Zicheng, a former postal worker from Shanxi province. Like Zhu Yuanzhang centuries earlier, Li's rise was born of hunger, humiliation, and state failure rather than grand vision. Li Zicheng organized disparate bands into a disciplined force, promising tax relief, an end to corruption, and the restoration of moral order. His message resonated deeply with populations that had lost all faith in the Ming court. As his army expanded, local defenses collapsed with alarming speed. Garrisons deserted or surrendered without resistance, often joining the rebels rather than fighting them. The authority of the state dissolved not through a single decisive defeat, but through countless small acts of abandonment. At the same time, another rebel leader, Zhang Xianchong, unleashed devastation in the southwest. Zhang's campaigns were marked by extreme violence, leaving entire regions depopulated. While his forces did not directly threaten the capital in the same way as Li's, they further destabilized the empire and drained resources that the Ming could ill afford to lose. Together, these uprisings exposed the complete breakdown of imperial control over the countryside. The Ming court in Beijing responded with confusion and denial. Factional infighting paralyzed decision-making, as officials blamed one another rather than confronting the scale of the crisis. The Emperor Chongzhen, who ascended the throne in the year 1627, was diligent and deeply concerned, but he inherited a system already hollowed out. Suspicious of ministers and isolated by palace intrigue, he struggled to impose coherent policy. Loyal officials were dismissed or executed on suspicion of disloyalty, further weakening the government at its moment of greatest need. Meanwhile, an even greater threat gathered beyond the Great Wall. To the northeast, the Manchu state was consolidating power under leaders who would soon establish the Qing dynasty. Originally known as the later Jin, the Manchus reorganized their society and military through the banner system, creating a formidable fighting force. While the Ming court focused on internal rebellion, the northern frontier deteriorated, and defenses crumbled under pressure. In the year 1644, Li Zicheng's forces advanced toward Beijing. The capital, starved of supplies and morale, offered little resistance. On the fourth month of that year, Li's army entered the city. The fall of Beijing was swift and anticlimactic, a final confirmation that the Ming dynasty no longer existed as a functioning state. Confronted with defeat, the Chongzhen emperor retreated to Jingshan Hill behind the Forbidden City and took his own life, ending his reign in isolation and despair. With the emperor dead and the capital lost, the Ming dynasty effectively collapsed. Li Zicheng declared the establishment of a new regime, but his victory proved fragile. His forces lacked administrative experience, discipline, and the ability to secure lasting loyalty from the population. In the chaos that followed, Ming General Wu Sangui made a fateful decision. Stationed at Shanhai Pass, the strategic gateway between the Great Wall and the northeast, Wu faced a choice between resisting the rebels alone or seeking external assistance. Wu Sangui chose to ally with the Manchus. In a move that would reshape Chinese history, he opened the gates of Shanhai Pass to Manchu forces, allowing them to enter China proper. Together, They defeated Li Zicheng's army, driving him from the capital. What began as an act of desperation soon revealed its true consequence. The Manchus did not come as temporary allies, but as conquerors. The entry of Manchu forces marked the definitive end of Ming rule over China. Although remnants of the Ming court would continue to resist in the south for several years, the dynasty as a unified political entity was finished. The collapse was total, rooted in environmental catastrophe, fiscal failure, and institutional decay that had accumulated over generations. The fall of the Ming dynasty echoed the earlier collapse of the Yuan, but with a crucial difference. Where the Ming had risen from popular rebellion to restore native rule, its end opened the door to another foreign dynasty. The lessons that Hongwu had once drawn from Mongol failure were now painfully relevant once again. The state had not been destroyed by a single enemy, but by the gradual unraveling of its ability to govern, protect, and sustain its people. As the Manchus advanced and the old order crumbled, a new era was about to begin. The Qing dynasty would inherit a vast land scarred by famine, rebellion, and betrayal. How it would consolidate power, and at what cost, would define the next chapter of Imperial China's long and turbulent history. The entry of Manchu forces through Shanhai Pass did not immediately create a stable new empire. Instead, it marked the beginning of a prolonged and often brutal process through which the Qing dynasty imposed its authority over a land exhausted by war, famine, and political collapse. The Manchus, a minority ruling over a vast Han Chinese population, understood that conquest alone was insufficient. Survival required a careful balance of coercion, adaptation, and calculated continuity with existing institutions. Following the defeat of Li Zicheng in the year 1644, the Manchus proclaimed the establishment of the Qing dynasty in Beijing. They presented themselves not merely as conquerors, but as legitimate heirs to the mandate of heaven, emphasizing their role in restoring order after Ming failure. To reinforce this claim, they retained much of the Ming administrative framework, preserving the civil service examination system, Confucian rituals, and bureaucratic hierarchies. This continuity reassured segments of the scholar-official class that their status and livelihoods could endure under the new regime. Yet legitimacy also required unmistakable symbols of dominance. One of the most controversial policies imposed by the Qing was the mandatory adoption of Manchu hairstyle and dress, most notably the Q order, which required Han Chinese men to shave the front of their heads and wear their hair in a braided tail. The slogan, "Keep your hair and lose your head," or "Keep your head and cut your hair," captured the severity of enforcement. Resistance was met with mass executions, turning what might have been a cultural edict into a tool of terror. This policy served a dual purpose. It visually marked submission to Qing authority and made dissent immediately identifiable. Military force underpinned every stage of Qing consolidation. The banner system, which organized Manchu society into military administrative units, provided the backbone of Qing power. These banners, composed of Manchus, Mongols, and later Han Chinese units, were stationed strategically across the empire. They functioned not only as fighting forces, but also as instruments of surveillance and control. Garrisons placed in major cities ensured that no region could easily rebel without immediate reprisal. The conquest of China was far from complete in 1644. Large areas, particularly in the south, remained loyal to the Ming. Members of the former imperial family and their supporters established a series of regimes collectively known as the Southern Ming. These courts, based in cities such as Nanjing, Fuzhou, and Guangzhou, claimed legitimacy and sought foreign and domestic support. Their resistance, however, was fragmented by internal rivalry, limited resources, and the overwhelming military superiority of Qing forces. Qing armies advanced methodically, crushing one southern Ming regime after another. Campaigns were often accompanied by extreme violence intended to deter further resistance. Entire cities were massacred after refusing to surrender, a strategy that spread fear more effectively than occupation alone. The sack of Yangzhou and the destruction of Jiading became infamous symbols of Qing brutality, remembered for generations as warnings of the cost of defiance. At the same time, the Qing leadership understood that repression alone could not secure long-term stability. They actively recruited Han Chinese officials to serve in the new government, offering positions and honors to those willing to cooperate. This policy divided potential resistance by rewarding collaboration and isolating hardline loyalists. Over time, a hybrid ruling class emerged, combining Manchu military elites with Han bureaucrats who administered daily governance. Economic recovery became a priority as soon as military control was established. The Qing reduced certain taxes, repaired irrigation systems, and encouraged agricultural resettlement in war-ravaged regions. These measures were designed not out of benevolence, but necessity. A functioning economy was essential for revenue, food supply, and legitimacy. By alleviating some of the burdens that had fueled Ming collapse, the Qing positioned themselves as restorers of order rather than mere occupiers. One of the most persistent challenges to Qing authority came from the coast. Loyalist forces, including the maritime power led by Zheng Zhilong and later his son Zheng Chenggong, known in the West as Koxinga, resisted Qing rule from strongholds along the southeastern coast and on Taiwan. These forces combined military resistance with control of maritime trade, threatening Qing access to vital economic networks. In response, the Qing imposed severe coastal evacuations, forcibly relocating populations inland to cut off support for the rebels. While effective militarily, these policies inflicted immense suffering on coastal communities. The fall of Taiwan in the year 1683 marked the final major phase of Qing consolidation. With the defeat of Zheng Chenggong's successors, organized resistance largely ended. The Qing dynasty now ruled over a unified China, having succeeded where the Yuan once failed, by embedding themselves more deeply into the existing cultural and administrative order. Throughout this process, the Qing carefully crafted an image of moral restoration. They promoted Confucian values, sponsored scholarship, and portrayed Ming collapse as the result of corruption and neglect rather than structural failure. By aligning themselves with traditional ideals of righteous rule, they sought to neutralize the stigma of foreign conquest. The emperors presented themselves as guardians of harmony, order, and stability in a world that had nearly disintegrated. Nevertheless, Qing rule remained defined by a fundamental tension. The dynasty depended on the cooperation of the Han majority while maintaining Manchu dominance. Ethnic distinctions were preserved within the military and court, even as administrative integration advanced. This duality created a system that was both inclusive and exclusionary, flexible yet rigid, capable of adaptation but resistant to fundamental change. By the late 17th century, the Qing had transformed conquest into governance. Cities were rebuilt, agriculture recovered, and the rhythms of imperial life resumed. To many, the chaos of the Ming collapse became a distant memory. Yet the methods by which the Qing secured power left deep scars, embedding fear and obedience into the fabric of society. The Qing dynasty now stood as the new holder of the mandate of heaven. It had survived rebellion, resistance, and the challenge of ruling a foreign land. But the strategies that ensured its survival would also shape its future trajectory, influencing how it responded to prosperity, stagnation, and the unprecedented challenges that lay ahead. With conquest complete and resistance largely extinguished, the Qing dynasty entered a phase remembered as its high point, a period of consolidation, expansion, and apparent confidence that stretched from the late 17th century through much of the 18th century. Under a succession of capable rulers, the Qing transformed themselves from foreign conquerors into masters of a vast, multi-ethnic empire. Yet this era of strength also embedded patterns of governance and belief that would later constrain the dynasty's ability to adapt to a rapidly changing world. The foundation of Qing's stability rested on three emperors whose reigns defined the so-called High Qing period: the Kangxi Emperor, the Yongzheng Emperor, and the Qianlong Emperor. Together, their combined rule spanned more than a century, creating one of the longest uninterrupted stretches of centralized authority in Chinese history. Each ruler brought a distinct approach to power, yet all shared a commitment to preserving imperial control through discipline, tradition, and careful management of elites. The Kangxi Emperor ascended the throne in the year 1661 at a young age, but quickly demonstrated political intelligence and personal authority. He faced immediate challenges, including regents who sought to dominate the court and lingering unrest across the empire. By asserting direct control early in his reign, Kangxi eliminated rivals and established himself as the unquestioned center of power. His long reign allowed for policy continuity rarely seen in imperial history. One of Kangxi's most significant achievements was the suppression of the revolt of the three feudatories. These former Ming generals, granted semi-autonomous territories in southern China during the early Qing consolidation, had grown too powerful and too independent. When they rebelled in the year 1673, the uprising threatened to fracture the empire. Kangxi responded with patience and resolve, mobilizing banner forces and regional armies over several years. By the year 1681, the rebellion was crushed, eliminating one of the last internal threats to Qing authority and reaffirming the supremacy of the central state. Kangxi also secured Qing borders through diplomacy and warfare. He negotiated the Treaty of Nerchinsk with the Russian Empire in the year 1689, establishing a formal boundary in the northeast and avoiding a costly, prolonged conflict. This agreement marked one of the first instances in which a Chinese dynasty engaged in treaty-based diplomacy with a European power on relatively equal terms. At the same time, Kangxi strengthened control over Mongolia and Tibet, integrating frontier regions into the imperial system through a mix of military presence and local autonomy. Internally, Kangxi cultivated an image of benevolent rule. He toured the empire extensively, inspected flood control projects, reduced taxes in times of hardship, and patronized scholarship. These actions reinforced the idea that the emperor was directly concerned with the welfare of his subjects. Confucian learning was promoted, and Han Chinese scholars were encouraged to participate fully in governance, easing ethnic tensions without dismantling Manchu dominance. The Yongzheng Emperor, who succeeded Kangxi in the year 1722, ruled for a much shorter period, yet his impact on Qing governance was profound. Where his father emphasized stability and personal charisma, Yongzheng focused on efficiency and control. He was deeply suspicious of corruption and indolence within the bureaucracy, and sought to strengthen the fiscal and administrative foundations of the state. Yongzheng implemented reforms that centralized revenue collection and reduced the autonomy of provincial officials. He expanded the use of the secret memorial system, allowing officials to report directly to the emperor without interference from superiors. This practice increased imperial oversight, but also intensified the atmosphere of surveillance within the bureaucracy. Officials became acutely aware that their actions, and even their private opinions, could be scrutinized. Fiscal reform was another cornerstone of Yongzheng's reign. He regularized taxation, converted irregular fees into standardized payments, and sought to stabilize state finances. These measures improved revenue flow and reduced some abuses at the local level, but they also reinforced the perception of an all-seeing interventionist state. Governance became more rational and more intrusive at the same time. The Qianlong Emperor, who ascended the throne in the year 1735, presided over the height of Qing power. His reign extended for 6 decades, during which the empire reached its greatest territorial extent. Qing forces expanded control over Xinjiang, consolidated dominance in Tibet, and reaffirmed authority over Mongolia. These conquests transformed the Qing state into a continental empire encompassing diverse peoples, languages, and religions. Qianlong cultivated an image of universal rulership, portraying himself as both Confucian sage king and steppe Khan. He patronized art, literature, and scholarship on a massive scale, commissioning encyclopedias, historical compilations, and cultural projects intended to showcase imperial grandeur. At the same time, he tightened ideological control. The literary inquisition targeted works deemed disrespectful or subversive, resulting in censorship, imprisonment, and execution. Intellectual life flourished, but within carefully enforced boundaries. Economically, the High Qing period benefited from relative peace, agricultural expansion, and population growth. New crops introduced from the Americas, such as maize and sweet potatoes, allowed cultivation in previously marginal lands. Food production increased, supporting a rapidly growing population that reached unprecedented levels. Markets expanded, internal trade intensified, and the empire appeared prosperous and stable. Yet this prosperity carried hidden costs. Population growth outpaced institutional reform, placing increasing pressure on land, resources, and local administration. While output rose, per capita availability declined in many regions, leaving large segments of the population vulnerable to disruption. The state, confident in its strength, did little to restructure governance in response to these demographic changes. Foreign relations during this era were shaped by a worldview that placed China at the center of a hierarchical international order. The tributary system framed diplomatic exchange as ritual submission rather than negotiation among equals. While effective in managing relations with neighboring states, this framework left the Qing poorly prepared to engage with emerging global powers whose ambitions and technologies did not conform to established norms. The confidence of the High Qing emperors fostered a belief that the existing system was not only sufficient, but superior. Innovation was often viewed as unnecessary or destabilizing. Institutions designed for stability became resistant to change, and mechanisms of control hardened into tradition. The very success of the Qing in securing order discouraged experimentation and adaptation. By the end of the Qianlong emperor's reign, signs of strain were becoming visible. Corruption increased as oversight weakened, particularly within palace institutions. Military effectiveness declined as banner forces lost discipline and relevance. Fiscal pressures mounted as population growth strained resources. Yet these developments were masked by ceremonial grandeur and the lingering aura of imperial authority. The High Qing period thus represented both the zenith of Qing power and the moment when future vulnerability was quietly encoded into the system. The dynasty had achieved what few others had managed: long-term stability across a vast and diverse empire, but it had done so by reinforcing a rigid structure that depended on tradition, hierarchy, and centralized control. As the 18th century drew to a close, the world beyond China's borders was changing rapidly. Industrialization, global trade, and new forms of warfare were reshaping international relations. The Qing Empire, confident in its ancient order and recent success, stood largely unaware of how ill-prepared it was for the challenges that lay ahead. The prosperity and authority of the High Qing era would soon be tested by forces that could not be contained by ritual, conquest, or moral proclamation. The consequences of that test would redefine China's place in the world and expose the limits of an imperial system built for stability rather than transformation. The 19th century confronted the Qing dynasty with challenges unlike any it had previously faced, exposing the limits of an imperial system built for stability rather than adaptation. While internal weaknesses had accumulated quietly during the High Qing period, it was sustained contact with an expanding industrial world that forced those weaknesses into the open. The result was a century defined by military defeat economic disruption, and a steady erosion of sovereignty that the Qing court struggled, and ultimately failed, to reverse. At the heart of this crisis was the collision between two incompatible worldviews. The Qing continued to operate within the framework of the tributary system, which assumed China's cultural and moral superiority and framed foreign relations as hierarchical ritual. European powers, driven by industrial capitalism and imperial expansion, approached China as a market to be opened and exploited. These fundamentally different assumptions made meaningful negotiation almost impossible. British merchants had long sought to correct a trade imbalance created by European demand for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. By the early 19th century, opium exported from British-controlled India became the primary means of achieving that goal. Opium consumption spread rapidly across China, draining silver from the economy and undermining social stability. Despite repeated imperial bans, enforcement proved ineffective, weakened by corruption and the sheer scale of the trade. In the year 1839, the Qing court took decisive action. Commissioner Lin Zexu was appointed to suppress the opium trade in Canton. He confiscated and destroyed vast quantities of opium and appealed directly to British authorities to halt the trade. These actions triggered a military response. The First Opium War began shortly thereafter, revealing the profound technological and organizational gap between Qing forces and British naval power. The war ended in the year 1842 with the Treaty of Nanjing, the first of what would later be called the Unequal Treaties. Under its terms, China ceded Hong Kong, opened 5 treaty ports to foreign trade, granted extraterritorial rights to British citizens, and paid a large indemnity. The treaty marked a turning point. For the first time, a Chinese dynasty formally accepted terms imposed by a foreign power through force, shattering the illusion of imperial invulnerability. Rather than serving as a catalyst for comprehensive reform, the defeat deepened internal paralysis. Court debates became increasingly polarized between officials who advocated limited adaptation and those who insisted on preserving tradition at all costs. The state responded piecemeal, attempting to preserve the existing order while making minimal concessions to foreign demands. This approach satisfied neither side and left China vulnerable to further pressure. The Second Opium War, fought from the year 1856 to 1860, intensified these dynamics. British and French forces advanced on Beijing, culminating in the burning of the old Summer Palace, an act that resonated as a profound humiliation. New treaties expanded foreign privileges, legalized the opium trade, opened additional ports, and allowed foreign legations to be established in the capital. Qing sovereignty was further compromised, and the authority of the court visibly weakened. Simultaneously, the Qing faced internal upheaval on an unprecedented scale. The Taiping Rebellion, which erupted in the year 1850, was among the deadliest conflicts in human history. Led by Hong Xiuquan, who claimed divine inspiration and presented himself as a brother of Jesus Christ, the movement combined religious fervor with social radicalism. It attracted millions of followers, particularly among marginalized populations devastated by economic hardship. The Taiping forces captured vast territories, including Nanjing, which they declared their capital. For more than a decade, the rebellion challenged Qing rule across much of southern and central China. The imperial army proved incapable of suppressing the uprising on its own. Instead, the court relied increasingly on regional armies raised and funded by local elites, such as those led by Zheng Guofan and Li Hongzhang. While these forces eventually defeated the Taiping in the year 1864, their rise marked a critical shift in power away from the central state. The reliance on regional military leaders had lasting consequences. These commanders exercised substantial autonomy, controlled taxation within their regions, and built personal networks of loyalty. Although they remained nominally loyal to the Qing, the balance of power had changed. The imperial center no longer monopolized force, a development that undermined the very foundation of dynastic rule. In the aftermath of these crises, the Qing initiated what became known as the self-strengthening movement. Reform-minded officials sought to adopt Western military technology, industrial methods, and educational practices while preserving Confucian values and imperial authority. Arsenals were built, shipyards established, and foreign languages taught. Yet these efforts were constrained by limited scope, resistance from conservative factions, and a reluctance to reform political institutions. Economic pressures continued to mount. Indemnities imposed by foreign powers drained the treasury, while treaty ports siphoned trade revenue away from traditional channels. Foreign-controlled enterprises gained increasing influence over China's economy. Rural populations faced rising taxes and declining security, while urban centers became sites of cultural and social tension. The Qing state now existed in a state of constant crisis management. Each new challenge was addressed individually rather than as part of a coherent strategy of transformation. The result was a cycle of reform and retrenchment that produced limited gains but no structural renewal. Confidence in the dynasty eroded not only among elites, but also among ordinary people who experienced the consequences of instability firsthand. By the late 19th century, China had been drawn irreversibly into a global system it did not control. Military defeats, economic dependency, and internal fragmentation combined to erode the legitimacy of Qing rule. The dynasty still governed in name, but its authority was increasingly conditional and contested. The 19th century thus marked the decisive turning point in Qing history. External pressure exposed internal weakness, while internal crisis magnified the impact of foreign intrusion. Together, they dismantled the assumptions that had sustained imperial governance for centuries. The Qing dynasty entered the modern era not as a confident empire, but as a state struggling to survive in a world that had fundamentally changed. By the final decades of the 19th century, the Qing dynasty faced a crisis that could no longer be managed through partial reform or symbolic concession. The cumulative weight of military defeat, fiscal exhaustion, internal fragmentation, and foreign domination had fundamentally altered the political landscape. What emerged during this period was not a single revolutionary moment, but a prolonged struggle between competing visions of China's future, played out within a collapsing imperial framework. The defeat in the war against Japan in the year 1894 was a psychological and strategic shock from which the Qing court never fully recovered. Japan, once regarded as a peripheral tributary state, had modernized rapidly and decisively following the Meiji Restoration. Its victory exposed the failure of Qing reform efforts and demonstrated that selective adoption of Western technology without institutional transformation was insufficient. The Treaty of Shimonoseki forced China to cede Taiwan, recognize Korean independence, and pay a massive indemnity, further weakening the treasury and the prestige of the dynasty. In the aftermath of this defeat, calls for reform grew louder and more urgent. A new generation of intellectuals and officials argued that China required comprehensive political, educational, and economic transformation to survive in the modern world. Among the most prominent figures were Kang Yue and Liang Qichao, who advocated constitutional monarchy, bureaucratic restructuring, and the adoption of modern schooling. Their ideas found temporary support in the Guangxu Emperor, who ascended the throne in the year 1875 and had grown increasingly frustrated with the constraints imposed upon him. In the year 1898, these reformist currents culminated in what became known as the 100 Days Reform. Over the course of several months, a flurry of edicts proposed sweeping changes, including the modernization of education, encouragement of industrial development, reform of the military, and restructuring of government institutions. For a brief moment, it appeared that the Qing dynasty might reinvent itself and regain control over its destiny. This moment was short-lived. Conservative forces within the court, led by the Empress Dowager Cixi, viewed the reforms as a direct threat to imperial tradition and their own power. Cixi, who had effectively ruled China for decades behind the scenes, moved swiftly to reassert control. The Guangxu emperor was placed under house arrest, reformist officials were executed or forced into exile, and the reform movement was dismantled almost as quickly as it had begun. The suppression of the 100 Days Reform marked a turning point. It demonstrated that the imperial system was no longer capable of absorbing meaningful change without self-destruction. Reformists lost faith in the possibility of transformation from within, while conservatives doubled down on repression and control. The space for compromise vanished, replaced by radicalization on all sides. Popular anger soon found explosive expression in the Boxer Uprising. Originating in northern China in the year 1899, the movement drew on anti-foreign sentiment, economic distress, and millenarian beliefs. Boxers attacked missionaries, Chinese Christians, and symbols of foreign influence, blaming them for natural disasters and social decay. Initially viewed with suspicion by the Qing court, the movement was eventually embraced by conservative officials who saw it as a tool to expel foreign powers. This decision proved disastrous. In the year 1900, an international coalition of foreign armies marched on Beijing, crushing the Boxer forces and occupying the capital. The Qing court fled, abandoning any remaining pretense of authority. The subsequent Boxer Protocol imposed crushing indemnities, expanded foreign military presence, and further eroded Chinese sovereignty. The dynasty survived in name, but its legitimacy suffered irreparable damage. In the wake of this humiliation, the Qing court embarked on a final round of reforms known as the New Policies. These included the abolition of the civil service examination system, modernization of the military, expansion of modern education, and tentative steps toward constitutional government. Yet these reforms came too late and moved too slowly. They disrupted traditional structures without creating effective new ones, generating uncertainty and resentment rather than confidence. At the same time, revolutionary movements gained momentum. Figures such as Sun Yat-sen promoted the complete overthrow of the Qing dynasty and the establishment of a republic. Drawing support from overseas Chinese communities, students, and disaffected elites, these movements framed revolution as the only path to national survival. The idea of dynastic legitimacy itself came under attack, replaced by concepts of popular sovereignty and nationalism. The Qing court attempted to contain these pressures through controlled political participation, including plans for a constitutional monarchy. Provincial assemblies were established, and promises of a future parliament were made. Yet real power remained concentrated at the center, and trust had been lost. Local elites increasingly viewed the dynasty as an obstacle rather than a protector. Economic strain intensified political unrest. Taxes rose to fund reforms and indemnities, while regional military leaders consolidated control over their forces. The central government lacked both credibility and coercive power. When crisis emerged, it could no longer compel obedience or loyalty. In the year 1911, a mutiny in Wuchang ignited a chain reaction. Provinces declared independence from Qing rule, often with little resistance. The revolution spread rapidly, not because of overwhelming revolutionary strength, but because the imperial structure had already collapsed from within. Officials, soldiers, and elites defected or stood aside, unwilling to defend a dynasty they no longer believed in. As the revolution unfolded, negotiations replaced confrontation. The Qing court, recognizing the impossibility of restoration, sought terms to preserve stability and protect the imperial family. Power shifted decisively away from the throne toward revolutionary leaders and regional commanders. The events of this period revealed a fundamental truth. The Qing dynasty had not been overthrown by a single rebellion or ideology, but by the accumulation of failures that rendered it irrelevant. Reform had come too late. Repression had gone too far, and legitimacy had dissolved under the combined weight of humiliation, hardship, and loss of confidence. By the end of this phase, the fate of the dynasty was no longer in doubt. What remained was the question of how imperial rule, which had shaped China for more than 2,000 years, would finally come to an end, and what form the new political order would take in its place. The formal end of imperial rule in China came not with a battlefield collapse, but with a negotiated surrender that symbolized how completely the old system had lost its authority. In the year 1912, following months of revolution and provincial secessions, the Qing court accepted the inevitable. The abdication edict issued in the name of the child emperor Pu Yi brought to a close more than 2,000 years of dynastic rule. The Qing dynasty, once rulers of a vast continental empire, passed quietly into history. Pu Yi had ascended the throne in the year 1908, when he was not yet 3 years old. His reign began at a moment when the dynasty was already hollow. Real power lay not with the emperor, but with court officials, regional commanders, and political negotiators struggling to prevent complete disintegration. Pu Yi himself was a symbol rather than a ruler, a child emperor inherited by a system that no longer knew how to sustain itself. The abdication agreement reflected this reality. In exchange for surrendering the throne, the Qing imperial family was granted favorable terms. Pu Yi was allowed to retain his title as emperor in name, continue residing within the Forbidden City, and receive an annual stipend. These concessions were intended to ensure a peaceful transition and prevent further bloodshed. The Republic of China was proclaimed, and for the first time in its long history, China existed without an emperor. For Pu Yi, however, the end of the dynasty did not mark the beginning of freedom, but the start of a life defined by displacement and manipulation. Though officially dethroned, he continued to live within the Forbidden City, surrounded by rituals, servants, and the fading illusions of imperial grandeur. Cut off from the outside world, and educated by tutors who struggled to reconcile tradition with modernity, Pu Yi grew up suspended between two eras, belonging fully to neither. This fragile arrangement ended in the year 1924, when a warlord coup forced Pu Yi out of the Forbidden City. Overnight, he lost the last physical symbol of imperial continuity. The palace that had housed emperors for centuries was no longer his home. From that moment onward, Pu Yi became a political pawn, sought after by those who wished to exploit his symbolic value. Nowhere was this exploitation more pronounced than in Manchuria. Following Japan's invasion of the region in the early 1930s, Pu Yi was installed as the ruler of the puppet state of Manchukuo in the year 1932. Though styled as emperor once again, his authority was entirely illusory. Real power rested with Japanese military officials who used Pu Yi to legitimize their occupation. Isolated, monitored, and stripped of agency, Pu Yi's second reign was defined by humiliation rather than command. The collapse of Japan at the end of the Second World War brought yet another abrupt reversal. In the year 1945, Pu Yi was captured by Soviet forces and later handed over to the newly established People's Republic of China. Instead of execution or permanent imprisonment, he was sent to a re-education camp. There, the former emperor underwent years of political indoctrination designed to break his attachment to imperial identity and integrate him into socialist society. This final transformation marked one of the most extraordinary reversals in Chinese history. The last emperor of China became an ordinary citizen. After his release, Pu Yi lived quietly in Beijing, working as a gardener and later as a minor researcher. He married, wrote his autobiography, and participated in public life in a limited, symbolic capacity. When he died in the year 1967, his passing received little fanfare. The age of emperors had ended so completely that even its final representative faded without ceremony. Pu Yi's life mirrored the fate of the imperial system itself. raised to embody absolute authority, he experienced power only as illusion. His repeated elevation and humiliation reflected how thoroughly the structures that once sustained empire had dissolved. In him, the entire arc of Chinese dynastic history found a human conclusion. The fall of the Qing dynasty and the fate of its last emperor were not isolated events, but the culmination of centuries of accumulated tension. Environmental stress, fiscal rigidity, bureaucratic paralysis, and resistance to institutional reform had weakened the imperial state long before foreign armies arrived. External pressure accelerated collapse, but it did not create the underlying vulnerability. The dynasty fell because it could no longer govern a society transformed by demographic growth, global integration, and new political ideas. Yet the end of empire did not bring immediate stability. The republic that followed struggled with warlordism, ideological conflict, and foreign invasion. The structures of imperial rule vanished faster than new institutions could replace them. In this sense, the Qing collapse marked not a resolution, but the beginning of a prolonged search for political order that would define modern Chinese history. Looking back across the full arc of this story, from the collapse of the Yuan to the rise and fall of the Ming, from Qing conquest to imperial zenith and final dissolution, a recurring pattern emerges. Dynasties did not fail simply because rulers were weak or enemies were strong. They failed when systems designed for stability became incapable of adaptation, when fear replaced trust, and when power concentrated without accountability. The Qing dynasty survived rebellion, conquest, and internal contradiction for centuries. Its endurance was real, but so were its limits. When confronted by a world that demanded transformation rather than continuity, the empire responded too slowly and too cautiously. By the time meaningful change was attempted, legitimacy had already evaporated. The story of imperial China ends not with dramatic destruction, but with quiet surrender. A child emperor signed away a throne that no longer commanded loyalty, and an ancient political tradition closed its final chapter. What followed was uncertain, contested, and often violent, but it belonged to a new age. This long history remains more than a record of the past. It offers enduring insight into how states rise, endure, and collapse, and how power can survive for centuries, yet still fail when it cannot evolve. The dynasties of China shaped one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations, and their legacy continues to influence how history, authority, and change are understood today. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. What do you think about the rise and fall of China's imperial dynasties and the fate of the last emperor? Share your thoughts and perspectives in the comments below.